Hi, this is a 2020 Kia Niro. Yeah, so me and my wife were looking for an electric car. We did a little bit of research, and Consumer Reports seemed to like this, so we went out and drove one. And within 5 minutes of driving it, we had to buy it. It was just they handle so nice, and they're super quiet. So this car is rated by the EPA to get about 250 miles on a charge. That's its typical range.
So I have the top of the line Mustang Mach-E GT with the performance package, which comes with a bigger tire, a seat that holds you in a tight turn. It has MagneRide shocks, which are liquid-filled shocks with little bits of iron in it that are adjusted in a nanosecond as you drive. And if you're driving slow, the car will actually go up and down if it feels like it's going to bottom out a little bit if you're coming out of a driveway. But in a high-speed turn, it will adjust the shocks with pitch and yaw, and it keeps track of how fast the all-wheel drive is and how fast you're going into the turn. It will compensate.
This is a 2021 Chevy Bolt. It's a battery electric vehicle, which means it only has batteries for power. There is no gasoline engine whatsoever. It's an excellent car. As you can see, it's a compact car, but it actually has a surprising amount of space, and you can comfortably seat 5 people. It has a good cargo space. You can put the seats down in the back and fit quite a bit of stuff in there. I'm not sure, I can't remember if I just mentioned that, but it has about a 260-mile range on one charge. And I could go on and on.
Oh, this is a Tesla. It's the Model Y. It's the 2020 version. And it's basically an iPad with wheels.
Gosh, I think my favorite thing about it is driving around and knowing that I don't have any smoke coming out the back. Really knowing that there's no tailpipe emissions is really nice. It's also really nice to never have to go to a gas station. Like we plug it into the house once a week, and it charges up for local driving, which is what we do mostly. We don't have to ever stop and fill it up. It just does it at home.
The acceleration, the thrill of driving it, and no gas pumps in my life anymore.
There are many favorite things. I think maybe my most favorite part is that I can fuel the vehicle at home. So my house is my gas station. Every morning when I wake up, the car is ready to drive, and I never have to go to a gas station. So that's super convenient. And you only ask for one thing, but the other thing is it's really zippy. You have a lot of quick acceleration. It's just fun to drive.
That it starts and stops and goes forward and reverse. It works quite well. The appeal is electric vehicle doesn't pollute, but you sort of forget about that after a year or so of driving it. It just becomes another car. So but it's been quite convenient. So.
If someone was on the fence about buying an electric car, I would say the simple thing is go drive one. If you're not sure, drive one, right? Everyone I know who ever drove one of these ended up buying one. So if you don't want to buy one, don't drive one, because they sell themselves. It's really wonderful to drive. They're so quiet and so on. But the other thing is, if you have true anxiety about whether you're going to be able to get somewhere, buy a hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, so that all your local driving is on the battery. And then if you have to go to New Hampshire or Maine, you've got a backup engine, right? And then in a couple of years, batteries are going to be better, the cars are going to be cheaper, and charging's going to be faster. So waiting a couple of years is okay too.
I would first ask them their driving habits and where they typically go throughout the week and month, and if they have a backup car to use, if they have range anxiety. They have to figure out if a standard battery or an extended range battery is best for them, because there's a bigger investment for extended range battery. On a car like this, if you start out with a base Mustang, if you want to go from 200 to 300 mile range, it's a $7,000 difference, which would be about another $100 to $150 a month in your monthly payment if you were going to finance it. So there's a lot of things to consider. Do they own a home? Are they able to install a charger? Do they have access to chargers at work? So I would do a complete interview with the customer to make sure that an EV car would fit their lifestyle.
There are lots of different things I would say. I think one of the biggest factors is whether you want to get a pure battery electric vehicle like this one, where you have to have an electric vehicle charger to be able to charge it up, or you can also stop, on the road. But you can also buy a plug-in hybrid, which has a plug and a battery, but the battery is supplemental to the gas engine. And so for people who are going to be doing a lot of long-distance road driving, at this stage, sometimes getting a plug-in hybrid is a better option. But if you're doing most of your driving just around town and less than 100 miles a day or even less than 200 miles a day, a full battery electric vehicle is fine. Even if you live in an apartment building and can't charge at home, there are public charging stations around, and more are coming all the time.
Well, I think probably the critical question is how far do you travel? If you're doing a normal, I think most Americans commute 40 or 50 miles maximum a day. If you can charge the car at home, that's very easy. If you're making trips, a couple, 300-400 miles, it's fairly easy to recharge on the route. If you're driving hundreds of miles of a commute a day and you want to have to recharge, then it could be a problem, and if you're having a long business. But for the most part, recharging is fairly easy, so the concerns that people have about range of the things is really I've not found that to be a problem. But then the Tesla has its own dedicated charging stations, and they're quite well integrated. So other friends who have cars that don't use the Tesla charging stations have said that it's a real hassle.
To Right Luck Farm this evening, and for being interested in EVs and for bringing your EVs. I'm Susan McPhee, and this is Anna Vanderspeck, who's here from Green Energy Consumer Alliance and is responsible for the Drive Green website, which provides just an endless amount of fabulous information about both vehicles and all the incentives related to vehicles, which keep changing a lot. So with that, I'll turn it over to Anna. What we're going to do is hear from Anna, and then if owners want to stick around for a little while, you can maybe ask more questions, but we're trying to wrap up by 8 o'clock this evening. So I'll turn it over to Anna, and hopefully we'll get your EV questions answered. Again, thank you for coming.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So as Susan said, my name is Anna, and I have a presentation today that goes over EV basics, charging and driving, and incentives. But I know how much fun it is to stare at somebody giving a presentation for 40 minutes, so I'm going to encourage you to interrupt me with questions anytime. I may say, please hold, I'll get to that on a later slide, but the more interactive this can be, I think the more fun it is and the easier it is to stay awake. So definitely raise your hand, just shout something out. I'm happy to just have a conversation throughout. And on that note, the first question I want to ask is, can you raise your hand if you already have an EV? Okay. Sometimes I ask that and it's like 90% of the people raise their hands, and I'm always curious why they're here to learn more. But I'm glad a lot of you aren't yet and that I can answer some of your questions. So as a quick introduction, I work for an organization called Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future, which is a mouthful. But basically what we do is we offer programs that help people access clean energy technologies. So I'm here to talk about electric cars, but we've got programs around solar and renewable energy and heat pumps as well. And then we also do advocacy work at the state level in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island to advocate for policies that make it easier for more people to adopt these clean energy technologies. So we do a little bit of both. But I'm here to talk about EVs. So in the first section, I'll go over some why are we talking about electric cars? Why is this important? What are really the pollution impacts? And then in the second section, I'll talk about charging and range. And in the third section, I'll talk about incentives. So starting sort of big picture societally, a lot of people at events like this will say, how clean are electric cars really, given that we've still got fossil fuels on our grid? And this is data from the Union of Concerned Scientists. They have a really cool tool where you can type in your zip code, and they'll tell you what the relative emissions are based on the mix of generators on the grid in your region. So the average gas-powered cars emits around 381 grams of carbon dioxide emissions per mile driven. A plug-in hybrid, which is a vehicle that has a big honking battery that you can charge up by plugging it into a wall, but also has a backup gas tank, emits about half as much as that per mile driven. So I think there's a Toyota Prius Prime here today and a Hyundai Santa Fe. Those are both examples of plug-in hybrids. Obviously, the emissions impact varies depending on how much of your driving you do on electricity versus gas, but overall, the Union of Concerned Scientists estimate is that it's 176 grams of carbon dioxide emissions per mile. If you go all the way to a pure battery electric vehicle, you get under 100 grams of carbon dioxide emissions per mile, and that's about a 3/4 cut in your emissions. And this is a number that is going to keep going down. In Massachusetts, we've got really great renewable energy standards that require that electricity suppliers like National Grid and Eversource add a certain amount of renewable energy every year. So that number is going to keep going down year after year. And then a sort of shameless plug for one of our other programs, but I think Winchester, you've got an aggregation program, right? I see Susan nodding. If you opt up to 100% local energy through Winchester's aggregation program, or if you live in another community that has that option, you can bring those emissions all the way down to zero. So first myth to kind of dispel, EVs are really cleaner on a per mile basis when you take into account the mix of resources on our grid. This is a big deal because transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Massachusetts. We've done a relatively good job of cleaning up the electricity sector in the past couple of decades. Transportation is really stubborn and buildings are really stubborn. And the Clean Energy and Climate Plan in Massachusetts says that we need 900,000 electric cars by 2030. Right now we're around 60,000. So we really have to ramp up EV adoption in this sector. A lot of people at this point say, what about the battery? Isn't there a really big greenhouse gas impact from battery manufacturing? And this is data, again, from the Union of Concerned Scientists that shows the relative life cycle emissions from different types of vehicles, so cars and trucks, gas and electric. Let me see, can you see my cursor? If I have a cursor? Yeah. So here are the emissions of producing the life cycle emissions of a gas car. This orange bar is the manufacturing, and then this gray bar is all of the vehicle operation, all the fuel that you're burning. If you compare that to an electric vehicle, you can see that the upfront emissions are higher because you've got slightly lower vehicle manufacturing emissions, but higher battery manufacturing emissions. But the reduction in the emissions over the life of the car in terms of operation are so much smaller that it's an overall 52% reduction. And this is based on national data. Our grid is cleaner than the national average, so that would be a higher reduction in this area. And the same trend is true for gas trucks. So if you're worried about life cycle emissions, there's good data on that front.
What's the life cycle? What number of years?
These cars will last as long as other cars. I don't know exactly what number they used for this analysis, but I'm guessing it was around 15 or 20 years. Thank you for interrupting me with the question. Keep doing that. Another sort of big picture societal benefit that we really don't want to overlook are the public health benefits of electrifying transportation. If you've got a pure battery electric vehicle, there are no tailpipe emissions. If you've got a plug-in hybrid, there are less tailpipe emissions. And again, it's cleaner even if you take electricity generation into account. And the American Lung Association has actually done a lot of work on connecting these 2 points, because this is not something that I was taught in school, but the amount of air pollution that is really causing public health damage still. Like, you think of LA in the 70s and the smog, but even if you can't see it, it's doing a lot of damage, particularly the fine particulate matter that you can't see, but that is getting into our lungs and our brains even. It's causing a lot of damage. So the American Lung Association has this report where they basically spell out a future of how we're going to clean up the air by electrifying transportation and also getting cars off the road. And they're big supporters of some state-level standards to increase EV adoption and count the benefits in public health in the billions of dollars over the next couple of decades. So these are all good, nice, big societal big picture points, but I'll transition now to benefits to you, the driver. And the sort of transition point is efficiency. So the fact that the emissions are so much lower for for electric vehicles partially has to do with the fact that you can fuel them with electricity created by renewable energy. But the other part and the underlying part is that they are so much more efficient. So this graphic on the left here is from the Federal Department of Energy, and it shows you if you put in a certain number of gallons of gasoline into your gas car, where does all that energy go? And you'll note down here, energy to wheels shows that 16 to 25% goes to actually moving the car forward. The rest is lost, which every time I see this, it blows my mind that you're losing 70 to 80% of the energy that you're putting in, mostly to friction and heat and other things that have nothing to do with actually moving you forward. Electric cars are closer to 60 or 80% efficient, and even higher if you take into account regenerative braking, which is a way of capturing energy back that would have otherwise been lost when you brake. And this is part of the reason why they are so much cleaner, but also part of the reason why they're cheaper to fuel, which I'll get to in a moment. One way to sort of grasp this in your head is to compare the miles per gallon and the miles per gallon electric of popular cars. So miles per gallon we're all familiar with. MPGe is the distance that vehicle goes. Basically, you're taking the miles per gallon but translating it into electricity, saying that 1 gallon of gasoline has 33.7 kilowatt hours worth of energy in it. So it allows you to put all of these on the same graph and really compare them side by side. So there's a Tesla Model 3 out there. According to the Federal Department of Energy, its miles per gallon equivalent is 132. The Hyundai Ioniq 6 is 140. The Hyundais are always very efficient. The Mustang is a little bit less efficient because it's a little bit bigger, but it's still 103 miles per gallon electric. So this is a way to just sort of conceptualize the difference in efficiency. Because, I mean, we've been working on the internal combustion engine for over 100 years, and we've barely made it to 40 miles a gallon, but these cars are easily over 100 and getting more efficient. Well, the batteries are getting more efficient all the time. So how does this translate into fuel costs? I know that most of the people here are probably in Eversource electricity customer territory. You're probably also on Winchester aggregation, so you've got slightly different rates. But this is a comparison that we do for people who are on basic service for lots of different utilities to show how it varies a little bit. But basically what we have here is we've got 3 rows for the different utilities. If you happen to be a National Grid customer, you're welcome. The top row is for you. We've got the price per kilowatt hour, including both the supply costs and the transmission and distribution costs. Then there's a column just to say when those prices are good through. And then we do some math, assuming some basic efficiency for an EV to figure out how much it'll cost to fuel per mile on electricity. And you can see that it all basically comes out to about 9 cents a mile. And the last time we updated this with current gas prices and a basic assumption of efficiency of a vehicle for gas, it would be 14 cents a mile. So at this snapshot in time, the savings are about 5 cents a mile. So if you think about how many miles you drive in a year, you can easily do some math about how much you might save. We have a methodology document on our website, so if you want to plug in your own numbers, we can help you figure that out. There's also lots of calculators online, but the point is you should expect to save per mile of driving because electricity prices are generally lower and the vehicles are so efficient. This is cool that this is true here because compared to other parts in the country, we have relatively high electricity prices. If you were to live in Washington, where they've got lots of hydropower and very cheap electricity, these savings would be even bigger. But they do exist here, and I think hopefully some of our EV drivers can attest to that. Oh yeah, there's the methodology. The other benefit to you, the driver, is on maintenance, and this is a place where we point to a great study by Consumer Reports that looked at thousands of real-life drivers' actual maintenance costs, and found that over the lifetime of the car, EV drivers had about half the maintenance costs of gas car drivers, and this is largely because there's simpler cars. There's fewer moving parts, there's fewer things that are going to rust or corrode or break or need replacement. Regenerative braking is this technology I talked about before. That is a term that's very hard to pronounce, but basically when you take your foot off of the accelerator in an electric car and you have this feature turned on, it will slow the vehicle down faster than inertia normally would because it's recognizing, okay, you took your foot off, that means you want to slow down. We'll slow you down basically by running magnets around the wheels and capture that energy and put it back into the battery. This means, A, that your range is extended because you're not losing that energy, but it also means that you use your friction brakes less frequently. So there's less wear and tear on your actual friction brakes, so you don't have to replace them as often. So I definitely recommend this study. It looks at depreciation and finance and all sorts of stuff too, but the sort of top line number to keep in mind is half, and I think somebody has a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Bill so that people can get access to the information. Where does that play in this scenario?
It plays in less because they're electric and more because they're new. And all new cars come with a lot of software stuff that makes it hard for independent repair shops to do the work unless they're given access to that software. I know that there's litigation pending on that whole right to repair thing in Massachusetts, and it's something that we're watching. I'm not an expert on that, but I do know that a lot of people are worried about EVs and maintenance in the first place. For the first 8 years or 100,000 miles, it's all covered under warranty, and there you go to the dealer and they deal with it. There are very few EVs that have made it past that 8 or 10 year mark at this point. I know, sorry, I just got distracted by a typo on our own slide. That's not how you spell maintenance. Sorry about that. There are a couple of independent repair shops in Massachusetts that we've learned a lot from who specialize in repairing mostly older Teslas and Nissan Leafs, now starting to do Chevy Bolts because they've been around a lot or long enough. And they're working on this a lot. So there's a place in Worcester called AC/DC. They specialize in EV repair. There's another one in Lawrence, and we're as an organization at the state of learning from them to figure this out. But there's a lot of open questions about that. The problem is, or the problem or benefit, depending on how you look at it, a lot of EV issues that people have get fixed with over-the-air software updates. That's been a big plus for Tesla owners for a long time. Increasingly, other manufacturers are starting to enable that, and that is a whole can of worms that is new too. So that's probably not a satisfying response, but that's what I know at this point.
How
It's for the battery. The battery is warranted 8 years or 100,000 miles. So if something happens, if your battery stops working, it gets replaced at no cost to you. This happened famously with a Chevy Bolt with a B as in Bob. There was a manufacturing defect that prevented or posed a potential safety risk at certain types of charging, and Chevy replaced, and it continues to be in the process of replacing all of those batteries at no cost to the owners. It's good for a consumer that that is the minimum, because if something's going to go wrong with the battery, it's going to happen in the first couple of years because of some maintenance defect, and then it's just covered if it needs to be replaced.
Could you talk about the safety issues, the fire issues around batteries? How many know what the numbers are?
Yeah.
Say gasoline car fire.
So
Certainly been talked about that.
it definitely gets talked about a lot because it's very scary when it happens. It happens a lot less frequently than with gas cars. If you normalize those numbers, AAA has some resources about that on their website. Most of the time when there is a battery fire, it has something, there's a manufacturing defect, and basically somewhere it's short-circuiting. With GM, they replace batteries in tens of thousands of bolts because of 20 or 30 fires over several years. So it is rare, but it really hits the news when it happens. And so it is understandably frightening. My parents have a Chevy Bolt. I am only a little bit worried, but that's just because I'm an anxious person. But no, not yet. But they don't. So for that issue, that this is the best publicized issue that most people have heard of, is the Chevy Bolt. There it was, if you still had your car plugged in after it had reached 100%, and you happened to have one of the vehicles where the batteries were manufactured at a specific factory in South Korea during a specific time period, then there might be an issue. So there are ways to check, was my battery manufactured there, and things like that. But it is not as frequent as people fear. But it's one of those things that it catches your attention just like a plane crash. It doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, you notice.
But the main thing is not to keep the battery charged for a long time.
Yeah. And all of these cars have the ability to stop charging. They don't want you to charge to 100% because that's just generally not good for batteries. So even when the car says it's charged 100%, there's probably a little bit of buffer there. But for example, my parents have enabled the feature where it just stops at 80%. So it can still be plugged in, but it's not charging. And that's easy to set up.
Excuse me,
Yes.
can you expound on the fact that the battery reaches the end of its life? What happens to the battery?
Yes. So all of these cars have, all of the cars have lithium-ion batteries, and there is battery degradation over time. There's some cool data out there that it looks like it's about 1 or 2% battery capacity over time. So the battery should last as long as the lifetime of the car. Once we get to the end of the lifetime of the car, there are basically two things that can happen, and there are entire markets slowly building up around this right now. One is that even if the battery has degraded enough that you can't use it for a car anymore, it's still a giant battery, and we can use it for stationary applications. So there's really cool examples already across the world of electricity generators buying up a bunch of old used EV car batteries and turning that into a giant, basically grid-level storage plant to smooth out demand and supply on the grid. There's examples of them being used as backup power. So there's applications for those even when they're out of the car. One of the slides I had previously mentioned, these new standards, the Advanced Clean Cars standards that Massachusetts has adopted. One of those standards are mostly about increasing the amount of EVs that are sold every year, but one of the features of it is also that there's new requirements around battery labeling, so that when a vehicle comes to the end of its life, there's documentation of what is the battery chemistry, where was it manufactured, all of this, which will make it much easier for those second use applications. And then the second piece is battery recycling. These batteries have a lot of really valuable metals in them. Nobody's going to just chuck them in a landfill at the end of the life because they can sell the pieces. that is a space where there's a lot of growth happening right now. It is not like a clean process yet, but we don't have that many EVs that have been on the road long enough to need to be retired. But there's really promising work in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot of money to go into research on this. When we get to the incentives part, you'll see that basically that is also incentivizing recycling within the United States and using old EV parts in new EVs. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, but there's a lot of promising work being done there.
Just a follow-up question, the batteries, where do they originate from?
If it's okay if I pause on that question until we get the federal tax credit, the short answer is everywhere and anywhere, but mostly China, and increasingly in the U.S. Because of the structure of the federal tax credit. But right now, the Chinese government has been moving on this market for a very long time. The parts and the components come from all over the world. Certain minerals come from certain places, but a lot of the refining is done in China, and that was built into the Inflation Reduction Act. Lots of incentives to bring more of that into North America and specifically the U.S.
Does that include Chinese vehicles? Because there's quite a few Chinese electric vehicles that are globally being marketed around the world. Great Wall,
Yeah.
and BYD are two examples.
The federal tax credit has a requirement that the vehicle must be assembled in North America to qualify. The Inflation Reduction Act has a weird name, is touted as a climate law, but is really a lot of rebuilding industry in the U.S. It's got a lot of pieces to it. But BYD, there's a lot of Chinese EV models that are not available yet here, and it's going to be really interesting actually to see if they're going to try and bring them over, given the way that the federal tax credit works. But we'll get to that in a bit. I'm going to sort of move a little bit faster through this section. This is a graph that shows maintenance costs in a different way. Bye. Thanks for coming. You can see the left column is internal combustion engine vehicles. The next column is hybrid electric, so just a traditional hybrid. Third column is a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, and then the fourth column is a battery electric vehicle. This is data from the Federal Department of Energy, and it shows you, if you look really closely, and we can share the slides after, exactly what regular maintenance costs you don't even need to worry about because the parts just don't exist in a battery electric vehicle. So all of this stuff in the top right, the oxygen center, timing belt, spark plugs, transmission service, none of that exists in a battery electric vehicle, and that's why the costs are so much lower. So I won't spend too much time geeking out on this chart, but we'll share the slides and you can check it out. And then last but not least, they're fun to drive. I hope you all had some time talking to real EV drivers out there to hear about their experience. My anecdote is always that I have a 95-year-old grandmother, and she calls my parents' electric car the nice car because it's quiet and it's smooth and she can hear what people are saying. So they really are a superior driving experience if you get into one. Which I didn't care about when I started this because I came into this from a climate angle, but once you've driven an EV and then you get back into a gas-powered car, you're like, why is it so loud and what is that smell? And oh God, I have to go to a gas station. So talk to some more EV drivers. But with that, I'll move on to range and charging because I know that is a big question for a lot of people, and I want to get through this so that there's some time for more questions at the end. But basically, a lot of people think electric car, oh my God, I'm going to run out of charge in the middle of the highway and a bear is going to eat me. That's not going to happen for a couple of reasons. One is all of these vehicles on the dashboard at all times tell you how many miles of range you have left before you have nothing left in your battery. And that is a very smart system. It will adjust based on if you turn on the air conditioning or the heat versus turning on your heated steering wheel or heated seats. It'll adjust based on, are you driving on a highway or driving in the city? The car manufacturers know that this is your biggest concern, so they've spent a lot of resources making sure that the battery management software works. So you'll see in real time at all times, oh, okay, I've got 100 miles left, so you're never going to suddenly realize that you only have 2 miles left. The second thing is that EVs' range have really increased. If the last time you looked was just a couple of years ago, The Nissan Leaf had 107 miles at one point. Before that, it had 84 miles of range, or maybe just a little bit over 100. Now we're well into the mid 200s or over 300s, which sometimes when I talk to EV drivers, I ask how long their range is, and they say about as long as I can hold my bladder on a road trip because I have to stop to use a restroom anyway, about every 200 or 300 miles. So there are lots of different models with lots of different ranges, so you don't have to worry about running out of charge. Going on a road trip is definitely still a bit of a challenge, but it's something that you can work through, and I'll talk about that a little bit too. This is just a cool graph that shows how much range has changed since 2010, and also how clear it is that global manufacturers know that Americans drive a lot more than the rest of the world, and so the range of EVs has increased faster here than the global average because we've got wide open spaces and we drive a heck of a lot more than most of the rest of the world. Charging. There are 3 basic levels of charging. The first is when you take the cord that either comes with the car or that you purchase separately and plug into a normal outlet like that one, and that's called a trickle charge or level 1 charging. That adds about 4 miles of range per hour that you're charging. It is definitely the slowest option, but it's not necessarily something you should dismiss right away. If you've got a battery electric vehicle and you're able to charge at home and you only drive 40 miles a day, you could replenish those 40 miles overnight in 10 hours of charging on level 1. That's what my parents do. So that's not necessarily a good fit for everybody, but it works for some people. The next step up is level 2 charging. There you need a 220 or 240 volt outlet, which is the same type that you would have for an all-electric dryer. And you either buy a unit at a home improvement store or online and have an electrician hook it up, or there are also portable level 2 charging cords where you just need the outlet and you plug this special cord into it. That adds somewhere between 11 and 50 miles per hour spent charging. It depends on the charger and the vehicle, but this is when people talk about installing charging at home, this is what they're talking about. You can do it inside, you can do it outside. There's lots of different models with different levels of bells and whistles. But if you have driven around and noticed charging at like a library or a city hall, it's probably level 2 charging. That's what most charging out there is. And sometimes it's free and sometimes you have to pay per kilowatt hour, but there's a lot more of that publicly available than most people think, and I'll talk about that in a minute or two. And then the third level is called DC fast charging, DC standing for direct current. And these are the super high powered chargers that you see at rest stops along highways and that you would use for a road trip. They vary a lot in terms of size and speed. Some of the Tesla chargers go way, way faster than other chargers, but our sort of standard that we talk about is a Chevy Bolt, which is honestly one of the slower DC fast charging cars out there at this point. It gets around 90 miles in 30 minutes. We're now at the point where you can get like 200 miles in 30 minutes on some of the other cars, but that's for EV class number 2, is going over the differences in DC fast charging. So to recap that, 3 basic levels. Level 1 and level 2 you can do at home. Level 2 and DC fast charging you can find in the public. Now we get to the slightly more confusing space, which is plug types. So I'm going to set Tesla aside for a moment, and we'll come back to them. Everybody else uses the same standard for level 1 and level 2 charging, and that's this J1772 port up here. Maybe you saw it on some of the cars out there. What it means is that they all have a port that looks like that, and when you buy a cord or roll up to a charging station, it has a cord that's shaped like that so you can physically plug in. So everybody except for Tesla uses this right now for level 1 and level 2 charging. For DC fast charging, again, excluding Tesla for the moment, the industry has been split into 2. So historically, American and European manufacturers have used the J1772 combo, which you'll notice is just the J1772 with 2 pins underneath. So on some vehicles, you'll see that there's like a little flap that you can flap down so you can do DC fast charging. And then historically, Asian manufacturers have used a different plug called CHAdeMO. which looks like this, which if you were to roll up to a J1772 charger with a CHAdeMO, you just physically can't plug them together. The good news is most DC fast charging stations have each type, so you just have to pick the right cord. But I've set Tesla aside until now, and we're going to bring Tesla back. So Tesla has a proprietary, or had a proprietary charging port that looks like this up in the right-hand corner, which for a long time meant if you were a Tesla driver, you only use Tesla charging stations, and if you're not a Tesla charger, or if you don't drive a Tesla, then you cry and you pass all the Tesla charging stations and go use the J1772 instead. Recently, everything has turned upside down because Tesla has made the technical specs of this port public and has struck agreements with major auto manufacturers saying you can use our charging port from now on. And so Ford, General Motors, Rivian, Mercedes-Benz, Nissan, Polestar, Volvo, I think Hyundai this week, they have all come out saying starting in spring of 2024, we're going to release adapters. So if you have one of our vehicles right now, we'll give you a doodad that you can plug into your car so that you can use Tesla charging stations. And starting in 2025, we're just going to build vehicles with this NACS charger, which is used both for DC fast charging and level 1 and level 2. So this slide is very confusing because it makes it look like the entire industry is fractured into lots of different standards, which right now it kind of is, but it looks like everything is centralizing and standardizing around this NACS charger in the next couple of years. So, yes. So, yeah. So what this means for current EV drivers is if you drive a vehicle from one of these manufacturers, you're suddenly going to have access to a lot more charging next year. And if you're in the market thinking about getting an electric vehicle, it's going to be so much easier for you to charge because you'll have access to this much larger network of different types of chargers. So this is really good news no matter what way you look at it. It's just a little confusing right now.
There's no extra cost for going to a Tesla station?
So far, we don't know, is the short answer. Tesla earlier this year made some of its superchargers available via a Magic Dock, which is basically they built something into some of their existing charging stations that would allow you to use them even if you don't drive a Tesla. And there they did up the fee if you're not a Tesla driver. With this, honestly, all bets are off. We are watching this. They say spring 2024. I'll be amazed and thrilled if that's true. A lot of this is prompted by the fact that to get federal funding for building out DC fast charging stations, the stations have to be available to vehicles from more than one make. So that is what prompted Tesla to do all that. And I'm guessing there's also rules in that federal legislation that you can't charge certain drivers more than others at those federally funded stations. So I'm guessing they probably won't, but they have done things that have surprised me before, so we'll see. The requirement that's the bipartisan infrastructure law. The requirement is that they are available to vehicles of more than one make. So each state is getting funds through NEVI, it's the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, and each state is deciding how they're going to disperse those funds. So in some states, they've already said, we're only going to use this for NACS, and in other states, they're like, we're going to put out an RFP and see what happens. So I'm guessing a lot of it will be NACS or the CCS, the J1772 combo. I don't think CHAdeMO has much of a future in this country. These are some graphs. Honestly, what I might do is actually, is it gonna? Okay, I was gonna open up another window, but it's too complicated, so I won't. There's a lot more public charging than people think, and the resource that we would point you to on this front is called PlugShare, It's a crowdsourced app where people say, there's a public charging station here, and you can go around, you can plug in any address and see what charging is nearby. You can filter by different characteristics, so you can say, just show me J1772s or just show me Tesla charging stations. But this is a great resource, both if you're planning a trip, but also if you are thinking about getting an EV and you're like, I know I regularly need to drive to Buffalo, like if I were to do that in an electric car, what would that look like? So you can play around with that. It's also great because if you click on any one of these little flags, it'll show you what the cost is. Do you have to pay to park, or is it just pay per kilowatt hour? People leave photos because they're nerds and they want you to see what it looks like if you're charging your Kia EV6 or whatever it is. But it's a great resource. Go ahead.
Would it tell you if it's being used or it's available?
This resource won't, but the websites of the actual, or websites or apps of the actual charging network operators do.
This one does now, actually.
It does now?
If you say this station, it says there's 4 chargers, 2 are being used, and 2 will be done in 15 minutes. Like,
That's amazing. I stand corrected.
pretty precise. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I mean, it's on your phone, so.
Go ahead.
Some of the apps also let you reserve it.
Mhm.
Like a dinner reservation. So if you know you're gonna be in the area, you can reserve that charger and, you know, there's 4 or 5 chargers. You'll have access to one of them. They'll make sure that you won't be left out.
Yeah. So there's different network operators. The one that most people have heard of is ChargePoint. They've got orange on all their charging stations. But a couple others in this area that you might see are Electrify America and EVgo. And all of those have their own apps where you can do these things. And this is a nice resource to just get a big picture overview of what's available. And it's one of those maps where if you zoom in, more of these little flags pop up, so I definitely recommend pulling it up and taking a look.
What's the difference between the green and brown?
Thank you for asking me. I forgot. Green is level 2, orange is DC fast charging. And if you see a little wrench, that means it's being built or is currently under repair. A lot of these on the Cape are currently being built. Okay, I see that we have little time left, so I'm just going to say we've got guides to help you install charging. There's information on our website, or you can come find me afterwards to ask questions, but I definitely want to make sure we have time to talk about incentives because those are important and confusing. So I will start with the federal tax credit, and then I'll talk about the state rebate. The federal tax credit is now called the Clean Vehicle Credit, and it's up to $7,500 based on your tax liability. So if you don't owe $7,500 in taxes, the IRS will not write you a check for the difference between what your car qualifies for and what you owe. So that is one big heads up at the top. It's valid now through 2032, which is really good. If you're thinking about buying a car in a couple of years, you can plan out a little bit better than you used to be able. There's a list there of manufacturers and models for cars that we can talk about, or we can share after the presentation, but there's new requirements. In the olden days, before the Inflation Reduction Act, it was just you fill out a form, you get a tax credit. Now there are income requirements, so depending on which of these 3 categories you fall into, your income has to be under that limit, otherwise you don't qualify for the federal tax credit. And it's available for battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid vehicles, and fuel cell vehicles, if you can find one. And then there are new vehicle requirements, and these quickly get complicated. So there's basically 3 new requirements. The first I mentioned earlier is that the final assembly location has to be in North America. There's a tool where you can type in the actual vehicle identification number and figure out exactly where it was assembled, but the dealers will tell you too. The price has to be under a certain cap, and when I say price, I mean the manufacturer's suggested retail price, what is on the manufacturer's website, not what the dealer decides to charge you. It's the MSRP. Has to be under $80,000 for SUVs, vans, and pickups, and under $55,000 for everything else. And then finally, it has to meet one or both of 2 complicated mineral and battery component requirements, which gets to the question earlier about the supply chain of these things. So I'll show you what the actual requirements are in a moment. You do not need to memorize them. I just want to stress that. I haven't memorized them. There are lists out there of what vehicles qualify for what, but I want to make sure you understand what's behind them. So basically, there's two requirements. If the vehicle meets neither of them, it does not qualify for a federal tax credit. Even if it's manufactured in the US and under the price cap, it has to meet these requirements. If it only meets one, then the federal tax credit is $3,750, and if it meets both, then you get the full federal tax credit of $7,500. These are the requirements. They're hard to even read out loud. It took the IRS and the Treasury months to figure out how to define these and implement them. But basically, there's one piece about critical minerals, and that 40% of the minerals by value have to be mined or processed in North America, or a country with a free trade agreement with the US, or recycled in the US. So there's a lot of ors there. That's a pun. I never even realized that's a pun. There's a lot of ors and a lot of ors. And then the battery component piece is that 50% of the value of the battery components must be manufactured or assembled in North America. And these percentages ramp up every year, supposedly to give the manufacturers time to shift their entire supply chains. Again, you do not need to know these numbers. There is a nice website that tells you how much each vehicle qualifies for. So the US Department of Energy has this website where for every vehicle it shows you, it shows you, I'm going to actually start in the right column and then move left. So it shows you, is the vehicle assembled in North America? You need that to be checked off. Then the MSRP limit. What is that column? Is not the price of the vehicle, it's the limit that the price of the vehicle has to be under. So for the Cadillac Lyriq, because that's an SUV, the MSRP has to be under $80,000 for it to qualify. Then the third column, the credit amount, tells you the amount that that vehicle qualifies for. So they've figured out if they meet one or two battery requirements, and they just tell you the number. And then the rest of that is just information about the actual vehicle. So I'll show you at the end of this presentation, we maintain a resource where you can see the federal tax credit and the state rebate for every car side by side, so you don't need to do all this research, but this is what we're drawing from. This list is going to change over time for lots of different reasons. So manufacturers are going to change their supply chains so that they qualify. The US is going to go out and sign more free trade agreements specific to battery minerals so that more of our allies with whom we don't actually have official free trade agreements qualify. Those battery requirements ramp up every year, and then there's always going to be new vehicles that come out. So bottom line, if you're in the market, check what's available now. It might not be the exact same thing a year from now or a year ago. And then there's an important leasing loophole. So right now there's a couple of vehicles out here by Hyundai and Kia that are excellent EVs that do not qualify for the federal tax credit because they're not assembled in North America. They're assembled in South Korea. You can still get a federal tax credit for those vehicles if you lease, because if you lease, the dealership can claim a commercial vehicle tax credit that doesn't have all the same requirements, and a lot of them are passing on the value of that to consumers. Not all of them, but some of them. So if you're out shopping for EVs, you might see a lot of things that look like $7,500 lease deal. I think VW has been doing that with the ID4. That's them passing the commercial federal tax credit onto you, the customer. So if you are looking to save money on an EV and you have your eye on one that doesn't qualify for the federal tax credit, you may be able to capture that value if you lease. And that's something we can help you with, or the dealer can help you with. I'm going to go increasingly fast. If we're over by 5 minutes or something, is that a problem for anybody? Okay, cool. For the first time now, there's a federal tax credit for used EVs, which is really exciting because we know most people never buy a new car. So this makes this technology available to more people. For the used vehicle tax credit, the battery requirements do not apply, which is great because it makes everything a lot simpler. The amount is $4,000 or 30% of the sales price, whichever is lower. You do have to buy from a dealership to get this tax credit. You can't buy a used car from a friend or somebody off Craigslist. It has to be from a dealership. It has to be at least 2 years old and cost less than $25,000. And it can only apply once. So you can't keep getting a used vehicle tax credit for the same EV, just passing it on from person to person. And then the income threshold is lower. So it's actually exactly half of what the income threshold is for the new tax credit. And then starting at some point in 2024, and we don't know the details of this at all yet, the Inflation Reduction Act says that the federal tax credit should be available at the point of sale. The details of how this will work are entirely unclear, but the idea is that if you're at the dealership, you can elect to transfer the tax credit to the dealership so that they can take that right off the cost when you're at the dealership, which is a big deal because a lot of people can't pay $7,500 and then wait a year to get reimbursed. So we're really excited about this because it should open up this technology to a lot more people, but how it's going to be implemented is anybody's guess. Yes? That's what's not entirely clear. So there's... Yeah. Our hope and our interpretation of this is that it does, because it would be a real, like, dealers aren't set up to check your income. What may happen is that you have to go through some sort of process first and get a voucher that you then bring to the dealership. But there's a reason that this doesn't start until 2024 because they knew it was going to take them a year to figure this out. So TBD. Okay, moving from federal to state, there's a state rebate called More EV that literally just this week changed. So this is the latest and greatest on the More EV. There's now basically a couple of different buckets within More EV. The first is More EV Standard, which is just the basic. This is $3,500 for a battery electric vehicle, so there's no rebate for plug-in hybrids. The final sales price has to be under $55,000, whether it's an SUV or a sedan. You have to purchase or lease for 36 months. It does not have to be purchased at a Massachusetts dealership, but if you are buying a pickup truck, then it's not More EV Standard, it's More EV Truck, and there you qualify for a slightly bigger rebate. So this is really if you're looking at the Rivian R1T or the Ford F-150 Lightning, it has to be under $80,000, and you have to live in Massachusetts for all of these. There are now 2 ways to get this rebate. The first is there is a list of specific dealerships that are participating in a point of sale program. So you can go to, are you one of them? Yay! Thank you. So you can tell us more about this, I'm sure, but basically the idea is you go to the dealership and you get that rebate right when you're paying for the car, instead of, again, having to pay for it, then go apply and wait a couple weeks for a check in the mail. If you are not at one of these excellent, highly regarded participating dealerships, you can still get the vehicle and then apply for the rebate afterwards within 90 days at more-ev.org, and then you'll receive a check in the mail. What's new is that there's now a rebate for used cars in Massachusetts too. The rebate amount is the same, it's $3,500, but the sales price cap is lower, so the final sales price has to be under $40,000, has to be purchased at a licensed Massachusetts dealership. It's surprisingly retroactive to November of last year if you happen to have bought a used EV in the last year. And you have to sign an attestation form that, to the best of your knowledge, that vehicle has not gotten a More EV rebate in the past 3 years. Here there are income requirements, so for More EV Standard there are not. For More EV Used there are. And basically you have 2 ways of proving that you meet those. Either you show proof that you participate in one of a list of income qualified programs like SNAP or LEAN or any of the many others on the list, or you have to provide proof that your adjusted gross income is under these limits. Right now, the only way that you can apply to this is post-purchase by applying online. But starting on August 31st, you'll be able to pre-qualify at the More EV website and then bring a voucher into one of these excellent pre-participating dealers. And then lastly, there's a new feature which is called More EV Plus, which is for low-income drivers. If you are in a program on a list of pre-qualified programs, then you can get a voucher for an additional $1,500. That list of programs is on the More EV website, and you can add this to either More EV Standard or More EV Used. And again, right now it's only online, but starting on August 31st, you'll be able to get a voucher online. As I mentioned, we have a tool that puts all of this together for you, which is available at greenenergyconsumers.org, and there are flyers around that will send you there. But basically, for each of the vehicles that's actually on the market right now or coming soon enough that you can maybe order it, we have sort of fast facts that you need to know. So is it battery electric or is it a plug-in hybrid? What's the range? What's the efficiency? How fast does it DC fast charge? What plug type does it use? We have all of that information, but then we also have the base MSRP, the federal tax credit, and the state rebate. And you can use this tool to sort and filter and figure out what vehicle is best for you, and then you can select the cars and sign up to test drive or pre-order with participating dealerships. I would love to talk to Vanel Ford about this because we definitely need more Ford dealerships in the network. But basically, this tool exists to make the buying process easier and connect you with dealers that can actually help you get an EV. I will say that one thing we didn't have time for today was talking about all the incentives to help you install charging. But there are plenty, and we've got a bunch of webinars coming up where you can learn more. So we've got a National Drive Electric Week event in Quincy, where if you want to come test drive cars, you can do that there. And then we've got 2 webinars at the end of September. One that's just a deep dive into charging. So if you want to understand how do I install charging at home, can you explain that whole NACS thing again? That's what that webinar will be about. And then we'll have an online session of just a chat with EV drivers where you can ask questions, much like you did here, but from the comfort of your own couch. So that's that. Thank you for bearing with me in this presentation that took a little longer than I hoped, but if there's any other questions or EV drivers, speak up. Yeah.
Are they available? Because we tried to buy a hybrid, and we're on an 8 to 12 month waiting list to get a hybrid. So what about these? Are they available?
It really depends on the car. So there are some where there's 8 to 12 months, and there are others where you can walk on the lot and pick one up. It really depends on which vehicle model you're looking for. I know, for example, like there are a lot that actually this vehicle, the Nissan Ariya, there just happened to be a lot on the lot right now. It's an excellent vehicle. Gets 300 miles up to 300 miles per charge. That one's relatively easy to get, but if you want to get a Chevy Bolt, best of luck. So it really depends on the car. Go ahead.
Early in the presentation, you talked about miles per gallon and electric, comparing electric and gallon. How is that comparison done to come up with that number comparison?
We are pulling that data from the U.S. Department of Energy fueleconomy.gov site. They do math. And we pay attention to them because they're a federal agency.
U.S. Department of Energy?
Yeah, it's fueleconomy.gov. They have a comparison tool for different EV models, and they show the MPG and the MPGE, and also the efficiency in terms of how many kilowatt hours are used per 100 miles of driving. So they have a whole testing regime that they put the vehicles through. I'm sorry, I can't tell you more than that.
Earlier you mentioned a commercial tax incentive.
Yes.
Since I'm a business, if I bought F-150 Lightning for my business, that would be a commercial purchase, correct?
Yes, you would get a federal commercial tax credit and you would qualify for the More EV state rebate. And if you have more than one vehicle in your fleet and want help electrifying the whole fleet, the Mass Clean Energy Center has a Mass Fleet Advisor program where you can go in and they can help you, and then the utilities also have incentives to help you install charging.
Some discounts in install.
Yeah, so they'll cover the infrastructure upgrades that you need, and then depending on what kind of fleet you are and where you're located, there might be even more incentives than that. But there's a lot of help now for fleets that didn't exist a year ago. Yeah. We have, so on one of the slides there was that I went through quickly, we have a guide. I will say it is challenging in a condo. There are, basically it's hard for me to give advice because there's so many different ways that condos are set up. It matters where your parking is, how far away is it from the electrical service, are the spots assigned, are the spots deeded. I would say check out the resources on our website and then talk to us or a charging installer more specifically. There is, in some places in Boston, for example, there's a right to charge rule that basically a condo association cannot say, no, you're not allowed to install charging because we think it's ugly, that they have to have a real reason to say no. And there are a couple of bills in the legislature right now to expand that statewide so that if you're willing to pay for a charging station for your own charger, that a condo association can't say no. So we've heard horror stories from condo associations and we've heard great stories from condo associations. So it's really variable, but there's a lot of companies that specialize in this who can also help walk you through it.
Anyway, let's all thank